Westbrook College prides itself on being one of the most prestigious colleges for literature and humanities in the country. The ancient stone buildings covered in ivy, the library with millions of rare books, and especially the team of veteran professors all contribute to the reputation of this school that is more than 150 years old. The school's English literature department is considered the most difficult to get into, where only the most outstanding students can be accepted. Marcus Johnson is not your typical Westbrook student. He comes from a poor neighborhood on the south side of Chicago, the son of a single mother who worked as a nurse and a father who died when he was young. Marcus grew up in a small, cramped apartment, but always had a wide world opening up in his mind thanks to the books he borrowed from the public library. From Shakespeare to Toni Morrison, from James Joyce to Gabriel Garcia Marquez, Marcus immersed himself in literature from a young age. Winning a full scholarship to Westbrook was something Marcus never dared to dream of. But with a near-perfect SAT score and an essay on the intersection of tradition and modernity in post-colonial literature that wowed the admissions committee, Marcus did just that. When Marcus walked into his first class at Westbrook, 19th century English literature, he felt both excited and nervous. Excited that he would finally be studying with some of the top professors in the field, and nervous because of the stares he would get. In a room of 30 students, Marcus was one of only 2 black students, and the only one from a low-income family. Professor William Harrington, a tall, thin man with silver hair and gold-rimmed glasses, was a renowned expert on Victorian literature. He had published more than a dozen books and was considered one of the foremost scholars of Charles Dickens. When Professor Harrington walked into the classroom in his classic tweed suit, the room fell silent. "Welcome to 19th century English literature," Professor Harrington began. "This course will not be easy. I expect excellence and do not tolerate mediocrity. If you are not prepared to read at least 300 pages a week and analyze them with intellectual acumen, then perhaps you should find another course." Professor Harrington's eyes scanned the room and stopped when he saw Marcus. An enigmatic smile crossed his face. "Ah, I see we have some new faces in the diversity program. I hope you're keeping up." Marcus nodded slightly, trying not to show his annoyance at the implicit remark that he had only gotten into the school because of the diversity program, not because of his actual ability. "I'll do my best, Professor," Marcus replied politely. Professor Harrington nodded skeptically and began his lecture on the importance of Charles Dickens in 19th century English literature. Throughout the 2-hour class, the professor occasionally asked questions of the students and seemed to target Marcus with difficult ones. "Mr. Johnson, how would Dickens's use of symbolism in Bleak House compare to George Eliot's approach in Middlemarch?" Marcus answered the question thoughtfully, pointing out that while Dickens used visual and sometimes almost exaggerated symbolism to critique society, Eliot used more subtle symbolism to explore the inner conflicts of his characters. He cited specific examples from both works to illustrate his point. Professor Harrington seemed a little surprised, but quickly regained his composure. "An interesting answer. However, I'm not sure you really grasp the complexity of Eliot's use of language. Perhaps you should reread Middlemarch with more attention." Marcus wanted to point out that he had read Middlemarch 3 times and had even written an essay on its use of symbolism in high school. But he decided to keep quiet and just nod. When the class ended, Marcus felt a mixture of disappointment and determination. He knew that he would have to prove himself many times over compared to the other students. The following week, Marcus attended a seminar on contemporary literary theory taught by Professor Elizabeth Blackwell. Professor Blackwell, a middle-aged woman with red hair and piercing eyes, was a leading scholar of postmodern theory. She was known for her sharp wit and demanding nature of her students. "Today we will discuss the relationship between power and knowledge in Foucault's theory," Professor Blackwell began. "Who can explain Foucault's concept of power networks?" A few students raised their hands, but Marcus decided to keep quiet, watching to see how the seminar would work. "Mr. Johnson," Professor Blackwell said abruptly, calling Marcus's name even though he hadn't raised his hand. "I'm curious about your perspective on this concept. Would you mind sharing?" Marcus took a deep breath. According to Foucault, power is not simply something that one person or group wields to impose on others. Rather, it is a network of relationships, practices, and discourses in which we all participate. Power not only oppresses but also produces knowledge, creates subjects, and shapes social reality. Professor Blackwell raised an eyebrow. "Impressive. Have you read Discipline and Punish? Yes, Professor, Marcus replied. Both the original English and French. I find some of the nuances of the argument are lost in translation. You speak French? Professor Blackwell couldn't hide her surprise. Yes, I know what you think of as an adolescent, Marcus replied in fluent French, explaining that he had taught himself French as a teenager. I think reading French theorists in their original language helps to deepen my understanding of their ideas. A flash of annoyance crossed Professor Blackwell's face, but she quickly regained her professional composure. A commendable point, although I'm not sure a first-year student could fully grasp the complex nuances of Foucault's thought, even when reading in French. The remark was clearly an attempt to put Marcus down, but he decided not to react. Instead, he just smiled politely. As the seminar continued, Professor Blackwell seemed to deliberately ask Marcus more complex questions, as if to demonstrate that his understanding of literary theory was limited. Each time, however, Marcus responded intelligently and thoughtfully, citing a variety of theorists and works. By the end of the class, there was a palpable tension in the air. Some students looked at Marcus with renewed curiosity, while others, especially those from wealthy families and those with a Westbrook education, looked at him with suspicion and envy. As Marcus was about to leave the classroom, Professor Blackwell called him back. Mr. Johnson, I appreciate that you came prepared for class today. However, I must remind you that at Westbrook, we are not only evaluating your ability to memorize and quote, but also your ability to think critically and creatively. Marcus nodded. I understand, Professor. I don't just memorize what I read. I am passionate about literary theory and have spent years thinking about it. Years? Professor Blackwell raised his eyebrows in disbelief. You're only 18, aren't you? 19, Professor. And yes, I started reading literary theory when I was 13. My neighborhood public library had a wonderful librarian who introduced me to Barthes and Derrida when I had exhausted all the novels on the young adult shelves. Professor Blackwell seemed skeptical, but she just nodded and said, very good. I look forward to your first essay. A month passed and Marcus adjusted to life at Westbrook, though not easily. He spent most of his time in the library, immersing himself in books he could only dream of touching before. He didn't have many friends, largely because of his different background and lifestyle, but also because some students viewed him as an academic threat after his stellar performance in class. Marcus' first essay for Professor Harrington's class was on the reflection of social issues in Charles Dickens' novels. He spent hours in the library, learning not only about Dickens's works but also about the historical and social context of the Victorian era. His essay not only analyzed the literary works in depth but also connected them to contemporary social issues in a subtle and intelligent way. When the essay was returned, Marcus was surprised to see that he had only received a B-. Professor Harrington wrote some brief comments such as lack of insight, superficial analysis, and needs to read more critics. Marcus felt embarrassed. He knew his essay was much better than that. But he decided not to complain and instead to try harder on the next one. Similarly, his essay for Professor Blackwell's class on the disintegration of the subject in postmodern literature received a B, despite containing sharp analysis and a deep understanding of complex theories. Mr. Johnson, I need to talk to you after class, Professor Blackwell announced after returning the essay. After the other students had left, Professor Blackwell looked at Marcus with a stern look. I'm not sure if you wrote this essay alone or if you had outside help. Marcus felt like he had been slapped in the face. Professor, I assure you that every word in the essay was written by me. I don't understand why you would doubt that. Your essay cites many sources that are not on the course reading list. And some of your arguments are almost identical to those published in a recent academic journal. That's because I read that journal, Professor. I regularly follow scholarly journals on literary theory. And if there are similarities in the arguments, it's because both I and the author are analyzing the same text with the same theoretical tools. Professor Blackwell looked at Marcus skeptically but could not prove that he had cheated. I'll accept your explanation this time. But I'll be watching your work very closely. The real trouble began when the English department announced an annual essay contest called the Westbrook Prize in Literary Criticism. It was a prestigious competition for undergraduates, with a $5,000 prize and the opportunity to have their essay published in a prestigious academic journal. I think this is a great opportunity for upperclassmen to demonstrate their literary criticism, Professor Harrington said in class. His eyes stopped on Marcus. Although I would not recommend that freshmen enter, the competition requires a level of sophistication and insight that they may not have developed yet. Despite this warning, Marcus decided to enter. The theme of this year's competition was the intersection of literature and politics in the 20th century. Marcus chose to analyze the work of James Baldwin, focusing on how Baldwin used literature as a tool to reflect on and challenge political and social power structures. He spent weeks in the library, researching not only Baldwin but also the historical, political, and social context of the era, as well as theories about the relationship between literature and politics. His essay, titled The Pen as Weapon, James Baldwin and the Politics of Truth, was a 30-page work of sharp analysis and insight into how Baldwin used language to disrupt and reconstruct political discourse. The essay was submitted anonymously, with only a code to identify the author, to ensure a fair judging process. The judging panel included Professor Harrington, Professor Blackwell, and 3 other professors from other prestigious universities. 2 weeks later, the results were announced. The essay on James Baldwin won first prize. When Marcus came to collect the award and his identity was revealed, the surprise on the faces of Professor Harrington and Professor Blackwell was palpable. "No way!" Professor Harrington exclaimed. "There must be some mistake." But there was no mistake. Marcus's essay was given the highest marks by all 5 judges, including those who did not know his identity. Professor Blackwell, still in disbelief, asked Marcus to explain his research and writing process. In a meeting in her office, with Professor Harrington and the head of the English department present, Marcus described his process in detail, cited the many sources he had consulted, and explained the reasons for each argument in his essay. I must admit, the head of the department, Professor Jonathan Marsden, an older man with a silver beard, finally said, "This is one of the best undergraduate essays I have ever read. Mr. Johnson, you have a level of analysis and understanding of literature that I have rarely seen in students, even graduate students." Professor Harrington and Professor Blackwell were silent, their expressions a mixture of confusion and shame. "I don't understand," Professor Harrington finally said. "Your essays in my class didn't show this level of brilliance." "Perhaps I didn't appreciate his abilities," Professor Blackwell admitted, with some reluctance. "Or perhaps Mr. Johnson has grown too quickly in the past few months." Marcus looked directly at the 2 professors. "Or perhaps you've seen me through the prism of prejudice and lower expectations because of my skin color and background." A heavy silence fell over the room. Professor Marsden looked at Marcus with newfound respect, while Professor Harrington and Professor Blackwell were at a loss for words. "Perhaps you're right, Mr. Johnson," Professor Marsden finally said. "And if that's true, it's a shame for Westbrook and for my colleagues. We pride ourselves on academic excellence, but we also have to recognize and confront the biases that may exist within ourselves." After that meeting, things began to change. Marcus's paper was published in Critical Inquiry, one of the leading academic journals on critical theory. He was invited to join a research group led by Professor Marsden, a rare honor for a freshman. Professors Harrington and Blackwell, though initially reluctant, gradually began to evaluate Marcus's work more fairly. They stopped trying to pick on him in class, and instead, sometimes sought his perspective on complex issues. Near the end of the school year, Marcus received an email from Professor Blackwell inviting him to a small seminar on postcolonial theory that she was organizing. "I think your perspective would be a valuable addition to our discussion," she wrote in the email. As the summer progressed, Marcus received an offer to work as a research assistant for Professor Marsden, a position usually reserved for seniors or graduate students. He was also encouraged to start thinking about pursuing a PhD after graduation, with the promise of support from several professors, including Professor Harrington and Professor Blackwell. 5 years later, Dr. Marcus Johnson returned to Westbrook as the youngest professor in the history of the English department. His first book, Voices from the Margins, Power, Politics, and Literature, received widespread acclaim and won a prestigious award in literary criticism. In his inaugural lecture, with Professor Harrington, now nearing retirement age, and Professor Blackwell, now dean, among those in attendance, Marcus spoke of the power of literature to challenge our preconceptions and broaden our horizons. "Literature not only reflects the world," he said, "but it also has the power to change the way we see the world." It can show us what we've missed, what we haven't seen because of our own prejudices and assumptions. And sometimes, it can show us that genius doesn't always come in the form we expect. Professor Blackwell and Professor Harrington clapped along with the crowd, their eyes filled with genuine respect for their young colleague, the man they had come to admire.